Welcome to Budget EDH. Today we'll be looking at Felisa, Fang of Silverquill. So Felisa is an Orzhov commander, and we're going to be working with a budget of 50 cents per card. And the themes are, we're going to make a lot of tokens. We're going to put +1/+1 counters on tokens and non-token creatures. And then we're going to try to proliferate as much as possible. Now, the themes are coming from Felisa's third ability. It says, whenever a non-token creature you control dies, if it had counters on it, create X tapped 2/1 white and black inkling creature tokens with flying, where X is the number of counters it had on it. So it's going to count the number of counters. Usually they're just +1/+1 counters. We don't have that many ways to create non+1/+1 counters. And another thing, we will also be all these inklings will come into play tapped, so it's going to be a little difficult to use them right away. She also gets mentor, so if you ever have a 2 or 1 power creature lying around, you might want to attack with Felisa and that other creature so that you could get a counter on it. Usually it's just other inklings. So for our creature-based ramp, it's just Palladium Mirror. White-black has probably one of the worst ramp options, especially at our price point. So Palladium Mirror it is. Next we have all of our mana rocks. There's Bonder's Ornament, Component Pouch, Decanter of Endless Water. And next we have Empowered Auto-Generator, Everflowing Chalice, and Noble's Purse as our proliferate targets. Noble's Purse is pretty sketch, but it's going to create treasures, and ideally, if we proliferate it, we can save up those treasures and actually do something with them. Next, we have some pretty normal mana rocks with Orzhov Signet and Prismatic Lens. Pyramid of the Pantheon is another proliferate target, but it's pretty difficult to proliferate that early. Next, we have Replicating Ring and Sphere of the Suns. Again, pretty good proliferate targets. Sphere of the Suns is just a really bad tap mana rock. And Seraphec's Tomb is pretty good in our deck because we're trying to be aggressive and we already have a flying creature so that we can take back the initiative pretty easily. And then we have Surge Node to put counters usually on Everflowing Chalice. But if we can put them on artifact creatures, but we only have one, and it's Palladium Mirror. Next we have Vessel of Endless Rest. That's just a 3 mana rock. It's pretty good, and not much else to say there. So in terms of card draw, we have Baleful Force, one of my favorite card draw spells actually. Usually it's gonna take over the game if you get it down early enough. We don't really have a way to cheat it into play, so it's just gonna be a top end way of refilling our hand. Blood Tracker is really synergizes with our commander. If you attack with Blood Tracker and with your commander, it's gonna get a counter, and then after that, you basically just have to pay life. But otherwise, it's gonna draw you a ton of cards when it leaves the battlefield, and hopefully create a bunch of Inkling tokens. Next, we have Mentor the Meek as a pretty good way of drawing cards whenever another creature, notably Inklings, have power 2 or less, so you could pay 1 and draw. Oracle's Vault is another proliferate target, and it's going to help us filter out cards. Not really filter, but hopefully you just exile the top card. If it's a land, you play it for free. If it's not, you probably just wasted your mana. And then once you get to 3, you can start playing cards for free, but that usually takes a really long time. You're thinking like turn 5 or turn 4 or 5 is your first time you're activating it, and then turn 8 or 9 is when you're completing the vault. So probably look elsewhere if you have a higher budget, but it does fit our theme of proliferation. Next, we have Minions Murmurs as our kind of a decent way to draw a ton of cards. We're going to lose a ton of life though, but hopefully you already have a lot of Inkling tokens, and it can easily draw you maybe 4 or 5 cards. Painful Truths, we're going to depend on our mana rocks and Exotic Orchard to get the 3rd color. Otherwise, it's just a 3 mana draw 2. And Read the Bones is literally a 3 mana draw 2, but we get to scry 2 first. Next, we have Sign in Blood, a pretty efficient 2 mana draw 2. Siphon Mind is a 4 mana draw 3, assuming our opponents actually have cards to discard. And then Ob Nixilis is a repeatable way to draw cards, repeatable way to destroy creatures, and is a decent proliferation target. Next, we have some of our removal. Deathbringer Liege is going to give all of our Inklings +2/+2. And then whenever you cast a white spell, you can tap a creature. And then ideally, you cast a white and black spell so that you resolve the 2nd ability. Whenever you cast a black spell, you may destroy target creature if it's tapped. I believe if you cast a white and black spell, you won't get to destroy any creature. You actually have to cast a white spell first and then a black spell. Custody Leech, it has the ability when you become the monarch, target player sacrifices a creature. Here's a hint: just target your opponent, and then they'll sack a creature. And then Monarchy is pretty great in our deck because again, Felisa is flying, so we should be able to quickly steal back the Monarchy if we lose it. And then Custody Lich really benefits from the Monarchy changing places a lot. Vishkal Blood Arbiter is one of our only sack outlets. It also puts counters on of itself. So if Vishkal ever dies, or you just sack it to itself, you can make a ton of Inkling tokens, and it's also one of our few ways of gaining life because Vishkal has lifelink. Next, we have Transmogrifying Wand, a great proliferation target, and it also just destroys target creature. Usually, you're just going to target your opponent's commander. You can only do it on your turn as a sorcery. Dance Macabre is an excellent way to kind of sack a creature that has +1/+1 counters on it. You're going to immediately reanimate that creature, ideally. If you don't, then you probably want to steal your opponent's creatures. 1 through 14 is guaranteed, and then 15 plus is just gravy. Hour of Reckoning is our one-sided board wipe. We're going to actually run a lot of board wipes because our deck is kind of a mid-range deck, and it's going to keep all of our Inkling tokens alive while destroying all non-token creatures. Next, we have Invoke Despair, a pretty efficient way of 5 mana Edict your opponent, and then probably you're going to draw 2 cards. Wanderer's Strike is one of our only proliferation spells. I know I talk about proliferate a lot, but we don't actually have a ton of options in white-black. Despark is just a better other end because most targets that you actually care about have a mana value 4 or greater. Next, we have Price of Fame, another variant of Other End, except it costs 2 mana, and Surveil is just gravy on top. The Wanderer is another way of proliferating, and it also exiles target creature with power 4 or greater. The first ability, prevent all non-combat damage that will be dealt to you and other permanents you control. That's very unlikely to come up. We don't run Pestilence, that would be the combo. So this is more of a flavor text than it is a useful part of our strategy. Next, we have Necromantic Selection, an excellent one-sided board wipe. You're probably just going to bring back Felisa if Felisa's on the battlefield. Sculpted Sunburst is another kind of one-sided board wipe. A lot of our Inklings have 2 powers, so ideally your opponents have a ton of 3-power creatures. If you're fighting against green, that's pretty likely. You also don't have to choose a creature if you don't want to. You can just say, choose a creature you control. Oh, actually, no, you do have to choose a creature. So you choose a creature you control, then each opponent chooses a creature they control with equal or less of power. So ideally, you choose a creature with 0 or 1 power, but we don't have any 1-power creature or 0-power creatures, so you're probably going to pick something with 2 power, and then everyone will basically blow up all their creatures unless they have a creature with equal power. Valiant Endeavor is just kind of a janky way of board wiping, but it's also going to create some 2/2 white knights with vigilance. So again, with the token thing, Unbreakable Formation is our way of kind of making these symmetrical board wipes. A lot of our board wipes are pretty symmetrical, and then it's going to put a bunch of +1/+1 counters on each of those creatures, and they will gain vigilance until end of turn. So the full combo is save up, I don't know, 8 mana because you need the cheapest board wipe we have is 5. So Sculpted Sunblast is going to if you choose a creature this way, exile each creature. Sculpted Sunblast is actually an exile. So the cheapest one would actually be Hour of Reckoning. So technically your creatures have vigilance, so you could potentially cast Unbreakable Formation, attack, and then tap them down to the Convoke spell. Finally, we get into our creatures, and these creatures care about +1/+1 counters, and then Avenging Hunt Bonder is one of the very few ways we're going to put non-+1/+1 counters on our creatures. Abzan Battle Priest is our way of gaining a ton of life. Abzan Falconer is actually not as useful as it sounds because most of our creatures already have flying. And then Avenging Hunt Bonder is going to put double strike counters on another target attacking creature, which is probably going to be Felisa, but maybe an Inkling. Who knows? Bastry's Lieutenant is another way of generating fodder creatures, basically. Whenever another creature you control dies, if it had a +1/+1 counter on it, create a 2/2 white knight creature token with vigilance. So it does check itself, but it also checks if itself had a +1/+1 counter. Bold Plagiarist, this is kind of a niche card. If your meta doesn't have any opponents who put counters on creatures they control, then Bold Plagiarist is very useless. Otherwise, Bold Plagiarist could get out of hand very, very quickly. Custody Soulbinders is a 4 mana 0/0, and it very easily becomes huge. I've seen this thing get up to 18 +1/+1 counters, and then imagine this dying, you're going to create 18 Inklings. That's basically doubling the Custody Soulbinder's power, and it also doubles, or it actually goes crazy, creating a bunch of creatures. You can also remove the +1/+1 counters to create 1/1 flying spirits, but in my opinion, you probably shouldn't waste your time. Next, we have Elite Scale Guard, a surprisingly effective way of tapping down your opponent's creatures. It's probably better than getting flying because sometimes your opponents have flying. Grateful Apparition is probably the best card because it's the only card that can repeatedly proliferate. It has the ability whenever it deals combat damage to a player or planeswalker, proliferate. So you don't have to attack players, you can attack planeswalkers. Le Zel Velakith Champion is kind of like a Hardened Scales. If you put one or more counters on a creature or planeswalker you control, or on yourself, put that many +1. So it's very unlikely you're going to put counters on yourself. But we do run 2 planeswalkers. One of them can't even get counters unless you proliferate. And then we do run tons of ways of putting +1/+1 counters. So it's going to double that. Not double, but +1 that. Luminarch Aspirant, one of the best ways of getting +1/+1 counters because it doesn't really cost anything. It's going to happen immediately, assuming you play on pre-comment main. Mikaeus is another kind of Luminarch Aspirant. You're just going to slowly tick it up, and then when the time is right, you're going to slowly tick it down. Myojin of the Blooming Dawn is a Myojin. I've kind of like these Myojins. They're basically cooler ways of winning the game. Technically, Stormherd is almost always better because even though it costs 10 mana versus 8. But Myojin is very cool, and look at it. It has an indestructible counter. If you could somehow proliferate that, you're in business. But don't be afraid to just remove it and create a ton of 1/1 colorless spirit creature tokens as soon as it's about to become your turn, so you can swing out with them. Next, we have Necropolis Region. It's one of our best ways of putting counters on all of our creatures. Orzhov Advocates, it has the ability, at the beginning of your upkeep, each player may put 2 counters on a creature they control. If a player does, creatures that player controls can't attack you or planeswalkers you control until your next turn. Now, that doesn't sound like a great ability, but remember, you can take this deal yourself, but then you can't attack yourself, which you already don't have that ability, so always take the deal. At the beginning of your upkeep, put 2 counters on a creature you control. Your opponents can also, but, whatever, we'll deal with that later. Seasoned Dungeoneer, it's mostly just an initiative. It's an aggressive card. It is a warrior, which doesn't really matter. And then it also has the ability, whenever you attack, target attacking cleric, rogue, warrior, or wizard gains protection from creatures until end of turn. It explores. So our commander, if you remember, is actually a wizard. It itself is a warrior, so you're probably not going to be running out of those creature types. And then exploration is a great way to put counters on your creatures. Ideally, you reveal a non-land card, and then you're going to put a counter on that creature and then possibly just keep it if it's a good card. Selfless Squire is kind of like a fancy fog. It's going to prevent all damage that will be dealt to you, and then it's also going to get that many counters equals to the damage prevented. Remember, this is pretty easy to tell because there aren't that many 4-mana flash creatures. There's the Bold Plagiarist and there's Selfless Squire. We don't have that many instant speed stuff. So make sure you only hold this up when you absolutely have to. Sun Titan is basically our mana wrap. It's the poor man's Primeval Titan. It's just there for value mostly. Debtor's Knell is a 7-mana white-black enchantment, and it's going to give us a ton of value, assuming you actually untap. Getting to 7 mana is pretty difficult, but hopefully this will help us fuel our creatures coming back because Felisa's third ability only triggers when creatures die, not non-token creatures, or token creatures don't count. Next, we have Noble Heritage. Noble Heritage is basically Orzhov Advocates, but it costs 1 less. It's way better. Legendary enchantment background. It has the ability commanded creatures you can own have when this creature enters the battlefield and the beginning of your upkeep. Each player may put 2 counters on a creature they control. Again, just like Orzhov Advocates, you can take this deal yourself. And then for each opponent who does, you gain protection from that player until your next turn. Keep in mind, that player can still attack you and they can still block your creatures. They just can't do damage to you specifically, and they also can't target you specifically. Enchanting or attaching to you is pretty niche, so I'm not going to even imagine those scenarios. Together Forever is one of our crucial ways of actually looping our creatures. We don't actually have that many ways of looping non-token creatures because, again, we need to take a non-token creature, we need to get a counter on it, which Together Forever already does. We need to then get it killed somehow to make Inklings, and then we can activate Together Forever to start the cycle anew, assuming we have some way of putting counters on it. Sun Droplet is just kind of a neat life gain way of uh, gaining life slowly over time. It also is a pretty decent proliferate target, so I put it here. Remember, a lot of our card draw spells is lose life. It's not actually damage, so Sun Droplet won't actually trigger off of that. Next, we have From the Catacombs, another initiative card. It's gonna put a very unusual ability called a Corpse Counter on it. And you might be wondering, does that synergize with Felisa? The answer is no. Basically, if that creature would leave the battlefield, exile it instead of putting it anywhere else. So, assuming you reanimate Felisa, you'll exile instead of putting anywhere else, and then in exile, you can shove it into the command zone. For any a non-commander creature, that creature is just going to get exiled forever. But taking the initiative is really, really sweet, especially since we don't have that many ways of gaining card advantage. Drawing a land is actually very, very impactful. Escape is also one of the few cards that we have that actually has sort of a graveyard as a resource. So this is a welcome addition to our deck, especially since we have a very slight reanimator theme. Not that many cards reanimate though. Next, we are going into our lands, of course, where you got the basic bounce land and the guild gate. Since we don't have that many of ways of drawing cards, guild bounce lands are great for our deck. All right, next we have the standard lands. Most importantly here, Evolving Wilds is basically our prime Sun Titan target. We don't have that many prime Sun Titan targets. And then, of course, Terramorphic Expanse and Myriad Landscape are the other prime Sun Titan targets. And that's it. Thanks for watching.